Hi guys, back at it this time with World War II. Just finished Great Depression. Hope everybody enjoyed that. Hope everybody got it. If you have any questions, please let me know. Today we're going to be looking at what some people believe is the most important event in American history. It definitely could make an argument it's the most important event in world history. The intention today is to sort of cover some brief things as many things as possible as it relates to America. It's kind of a long presentation, so I haven't decided. We'll see how it goes. I might end up cutting this thing in half and then throwing it up another half maybe tomorrow or something, so it gives you some time. But there's a lot of things to unravel here, and so we'll just get started. Of course, stay on top of things. There is an assignment I'm going to want you to do with World War II, just like Great Depression. We're almost there, guys. Couple more weeks, so stick with it. You're doing great. If you have any questions, like usual, email me or call or text me, whatever works. Okay, well, I'm just going to jump right in, and we're going to look at World War II here. Okay, quick review. We really have to start with World War I. Now, it may seem odd, but really to make sense of World War II, you need to understand World War I and what's happening here. So I'm going to put up some reminders here. Hopefully some of these things kind of ring a bell. You have the assassination of the Archduke. You have Belgium, which where most of the trench warfare was. So that's kind of connected with this one. You have Vladimir Lenin. You have the two causes of the U.S. involvement, which was the Zimmerman telegram and the sinking of Lusitania. And this idea that no one really wins this war, right? Okay, so we have to start with the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this is an important thing to help you understand how Hitler rises to power. This is the treaty that will sort of end World War I. And it was called the Treaty to End All Treaties. And it takes place in this magnificent palace called Versailles. And here it is. It's about 12 miles from Paris. It's very beautiful. It was built by King Louis, who had visions of this grandeur kingdom. And this palace, everything had to be perfect for him. And so they all meet here in 1919. The intention, of course, is to somehow figure out two major things. The first thing is, what should we do with Germany? Germany had been pretty much almost defeated here, but it was definitely not at the point where they had surrendered. Remember, this was a ceasefire. But they had they'd pretty much been defeated. There wasn't much left there. And the bigger question here is, what do we do about the world so we don't do this anymore? Like, how can we avoid another world war? So us looking back on this, hindsight saying, well, we didn't do a great job, did we? So keep that in mind as you're looking at this, that we're watching this thing unravel, and this is supposed to be the thing that fixes us. In the end, it doesn't at all. The pictures of this. Okay, so we're going to look at the big three here. And why we identify them as the big three, they're the ones who can make the major decisions here at Versailles. You have in England, you have David Lloyd George. You have Georges Clemenceau, who is the French Prime Minister President. And then Woodrow Wilson, our president. I'll talk a little bit about him and his mindset and so forth. Okay, so who was Wilson? What was his plans? What did he see? Where's he from? So he's kind of a Southern president. Remember, we ended this conversation about that the Republicans lost the House, lost the White House, because there was a fight there between Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, William Taft. And so Wilson, as a Democrat, is able to get in the White House. We haven't had a Democrat in the White House for quite a while, a Southerner even longer. And Wilson brings to the table a very academic background. He was a president of Princeton. He's from Maryland, but he's very ideological. And we know what that means. He sort of sees the world with rosy-colored glasses. And so he's going to want to see things his way. And this ends up being somewhat of a problem for us and for him, is because he doesn't really have this sort of, you could almost, I'm trying to be fair here, but he really doesn't have the same sort of backbone that some of the other presidents that we've had does. And so this is going to be a problem when he gets into Versailles, sort of pushed around by the French, and he doesn't really stand up and do some things that he should have. Okay, so let's talk about what he's thinking. He's thinking, I want peace without victory. Okay, so again, this is like, what does that even mean, right? How do you get victory? Or how do you get peace out of this? You know, when France is considering themselves, they think they've won this thing. He introduces something called 14 points, okay? And these 14 points are his ideas about what he thinks will make the world avoid another world war. And in these points, you know, they're good points. I don't want to say that I don't admire them. I don't even, you know, I think they were good, well-intended, but they were ideological. They're things that, you know, just weren't realistic for the time. But that's what he's really pushing. And so, you know, I think one thing he's really smart about is he's saying we've got to get rid of nationalism. Everybody remembers that, sort of this form of patriotism that, you know, you think your country's better than another country. And then imperialism, which we spend quite a bit of time on. And so this is what Wilson's trying to accomplish here at Versailles. So he also, the final thing he wants to do is he wants to organize this group. And again, not a bad idea, executed kind of poorly, but not a bad idea. It's called the League of Nations. And the idea is we get all of these nations together and we're talking to each other and we're in a league. And that way we can avoid these world wars. That's what Wilson envisioned. And really the League of Nations will eventually kind of, it will die out, but it will come back in another form called the United Nations, which we will talk about briefly next time. And that kind of gives you a little definition of what the League of Nations is right there. Okay, so let's take Georges Clemenceau here. I love this caterpillar mustache on this dude. That's pretty great. Let's talk about this guy right here. What was he thinking? Well, Clemenceau, you need to know, hates Germany. Always has, always will. So when he goes to the table in Versailles, he wants to prevent Germany from ever being a world power again. He's got personal reasons. It goes back to the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, where he saw his country humiliated by the Germans. He felt like Germany is the problem here, okay? And he felt like Wilson was too soft on Germany. You know, I love it. You know, he has this quote, Wilson has 14 points, God Almighty has only 10. Meaning that Wilson is too soft and he's too up in the clouds. And Clemenceau wants to make sure that Germany understands what's happening here. Okay, and then you got the Prime Minister, and Lord George is really just a middle position, really. He once said, you know, standing between Wilson and Clemenceau was like standing between Jesus Christ and Napoleon Bonaparte. You know, Wilson being Jesus and Clemenceau being Napoleon. Napoleon wants war, Jesus wants peace, and he's trying to somehow be a middle piece. He doesn't factor in. He's not a very strong voice. He tries, but he's sort of overpowered by the French as well. Okay, so what this comes down to, and this is where the French get their way, is they really want to punish the Central Powers. The idea is Germany needs to pay, and when we make them pay, this will avoid wars. Now, for those paying attention, this is going to be very important why a man from Austria is able to rise up to power in the 1920s and 30s. Okay, so we have an acronym. It's called BRAT. And this is how we keep track of what happens to Germany, according at Versailles. So Germany has to accept blame. Now remember how this war started. Remember how this war ends. The fact that they're accepting blame is a little bit dicey, but that's the first thing you have to do. Okay, this is where it talks about in the actual article. The second thing they have to do is reparations, the R. And what this is fines. They have to pay $33 billion to Allied soldiers, the French and English, and a little bit of the American wives and families of all those soldiers that died. Again, Germany is sort of like, wait, we didn't lose this war, right? We signed a cease treaty, and on top of this, we don't have that money for that, right? The third thing that Germany was forbidden to have was an army over 100,000 men. You know, one thing that Clemenceau wanted to make sure was that Germany was completely crippled. No submarines, no air force, and that way they couldn't ever fight back. And then finally, the territory. Some of the most important territory will be taken away from them, called the Alsace and Lorraine. What this does when it's proposed here at Versailles is it brings Germany to their knees. They are already in dire straits from the war, and now you are taking away everything that they have. Germany actually comes to America and says, listen, we can't afford this. If you give us some sort of option here, something different, let us be a republic like you or something. But we didn't really stand up. This is why Wilson really doesn't get really a great name, because he sort of just backs down when he should have stood up to it. The second thing that we talked about they really want to do is they want to make sure this never happens again. Well, their solution was, how do we make sure that countries don't become world powers anymore when we have world wars? Well, you split them apart. So you take Germany, Austria, before, look how big they are. And this is what they do to them after 1919. The idea is you're making these different states here, these different countries. And by doing that, you're keeping them from being too powerful. If they're not too powerful, they can't start wars. The problem, of course, if anybody knows anything about Europe, is they don't understand things. Like, one of the most amazing stories, Yugoslavia here. Nobody speaks the same language. Nobody has the same religion or culture, but you throw them in here and you make them their own country. And up to the 20th century, they're fighting all the time in Yugoslavia. I mean, it was just an embarrassment. But that's exactly what was happening. They were carving up the world to try to make this easier. Germany, of course, loses a lot of its important industrial places, and some of the borders here. And in fact, if you look at this statistic, this map kind of shows you they're losing a lot of their iron production, coal production, and so again, crippling Germany even more. Well, I want to show you what else is significant here is they also go after the Middle East. They look at the Ottoman Empire, which, if you don't know much about Middle Eastern history, this is this large empire that consisted of most of the Middle East, as you can see. And they thought it was too big. And they thought the Ottoman Empire should be broken up anyways. So they started carving the map. Well, one on the left here is what it was originally. And then look what gets created. And some of these names should mean something to you. Syria, Iraq, Jordan, right? Some of these places which have been a problem in the 20th century and the 21st century, and one thing that they didn't understand, if you don't understand about Islam, then you'll know this, that there is really two major branches. There's the Shiite and the Sunni, and they hate each other. Well, when the British and French broke up the Ottoman Empire, they didn't understand that they started making boundaries between the Shiites and the Sunnis, but they were in the same area. And so like a place like Iraq, the Sunnis and Shiites were shoved in this area. They hate each other. Same with Syria. So they're fighting all about this. And this is just them not understanding the culture of the people, and it causes problems that we're later going to have to pick up on. So let me give you one more story about Versailles, and then I want to get moving on to World War II, because it sort of leads to it, right? Is that even Asia gets involved in this. And there was a young man from Vietnam named Ho Chi Minh who came to Versailles asking for help, asking for advice, and America pretty much just shrugged him off. And he goes back to China, and he learns communism, and he brings communism to Vietnam. And of course, we have to pay for that. A lot of your grandparents probably did, into the 1960s. So, this was a very significant moment here at Versailles. Okay, so Wilson didn't stand up for Germany, didn't really do what he should have. He does get his League of Nations passed. Here's the whole ironic thing. But the Congress rejects it. They're like, we're not really interested in that. So we don't even get involved in the League of Nations. And Wilson spends his whole time doing that. So Versailles, kind of sum it up, Germany's really mad because of all the military that they lost, which again, this is going to give all the fuel that Hitler's going to need to rise up. Even Americans felt it was too hard on Germany. And Italy wanted more land. And Japan is mad because they didn't recognize claims in China. If you look at the major parties that are going to get involved in World War II, boom, boom, boom. This is why you need to understand Versailles to sort of get the whole thing. And that leads us to the coming of World War II. We call it the shadows of war, which means we could see it coming. We could see the rain clouds. We could feel it in the air. And by the time we get to 1938, things in Europe and Asia had gotten really out of control. In Europe, by the time we were in 1938, a new militaristic regime, what we call a fascist dictator, totalitarianism, will rise up in Germany. Now, what you have with Adolf Hitler, who was a young man, an orphan, he was a rejected art student in Vienna, a World War I vet, and he'd been injured in World War I, and a very good politician, rose up with this army. He was party member 55 is what they call him, and he rose up with the Nazi army, the National Socialist Party. And he is not interested in necessarily states or nations. He's interested in racial control. He believes that the German people, and many of you probably know this, is a superior people. And he envisions a world where the, I think social Darwinist almost, the lesser races are removed from the situation. Okay, one of the worst of them, the one that's controlling everything, are the Jewish people. In fact, that's at the heart of Hitler's sort of double colonialist ideas. He was going to kill them because if he didn't, they were going to take out everybody else. That was the belief he had. And he got a lot of people to jump on board because Germany, just from Versailles, was in so much turmoil. Japan, okay, Japan wants to be imperialist like Europe was. So they're taking control, and we'll see this when we look at Pacific Theater, over a lot of islands in the Southeast Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, all of these very major islands, and then they turn around and they attack China in 1937, and they take Manchuria, and then they start taking control of that. And so that's a whole mess. Japan's now controlled all of Asia. Italy is this sort of pseudo. They're fascinating because Hitler actually learns a lot from Italy. And Hitler learns a lot from Mussolini, who was the president of Italy. But what they do is they control all power to one organization inside the state. And that's who controls it. And that's really fascism here. And that's Italy. Okay, I know that's not a big explanation. And, again, there's a lot of fascinating stories about each of these. But we really need to get to America. This is American history. So by the mid-1930s, we had concluded that it was a serious mistake to go to World War I, right? We saw the whole mess of it. And so we said, when we started seeing things ugly in Europe again, we're like, we're not doing it. So we passed something called the Neutrality Acts, and everyone want to note that, where we said the one problem that we had in World War I was we tried to stay out of it, but then we got involved in providing aid and providing munitions, which is like guns and ammo, to European countries. And that really messes up the whole story there for us. Then we get involved. So we're just going to keep our necks out of this completely. Okay, in 1940, an unprecedented moment, FDR will be re-elected for a third term. Now, the reason he did this was that he felt like having an election right now was not smart in the middle of this war that was happening, was raging in Europe. And so we sort of went along with it, and he wins re-election. And that leads to, 1940, which is really when things get a little bit out of hand in Europe. So let's take a look at a couple things. So for those that are familiar with this picture, this of course jumps us into Pearl Harbor. So what happened here? One of the biggest questions that gets asked is why does Pearl Harbor happen? Why did the Japanese attack our ships here, our planes, our ships are in Hawaii? And to understand this, you really have to understand what's happening in the Asian countries and how we are not getting behind the Japanese. At least that's what they feel. So what's happening is they're going around, they're colonizing, they're taking control of China, Philippines, Guadalcanal, all of those small islands that are in those areas. And what's happening is they're taking control of them, and we don't like that. We don't like that they're coming in the Philippines. That's sort of our pseudo property, if you remember the Spanish-American War. And they're kind of taking control of other areas, including Comoran, which was one of our islands in Asia where we had control. So we cut off trade. Now, this is important to understand, is that most of Japan did not feed themselves at this point. They took their food, primarily the rice, from the Philippines, Vietnam, your Southeast Pacific Islands. So what we did is we cut that off. We also cut all transportation of natural resources. It was estimated that we cut 88% of all the oil going to Japan. Now, that's a big deal. Imagine if we lost 88% of all of our oil. When we did this, we started to notice Japan saw themselves as now kind of an enemy with us. And we knew, and this is a big one thing, was like we didn't know exactly how or where, but we knew that they were probably going to target us. And on December 7, 1941, which was a Sunday, Japan attacks us on Pearl Harbor. So here's an actual clip, and I'll kind of tell you about it. I'm going to keep the volume off here. So as you're looking at this video, what you need to note is that for 2 hours, 300 Japanese Zero planes will pound our Pacific Fleet, our battleships. And here you could see some of this photo, and it was so chaotic. These soldiers, these sailors running around, and it was really kind of a brutal surprise. And you're watching the Arizona sink here. You get the USS Shaw sinking in the background as well. And these are the Zero planes. We really weren't prepared for this, so we didn't really have the ability to fight back. In all, we'll lose 8 battleships. Some of them actually will be restored again, but 8 battleships. And we will lose 2,400 sailors here at Pearl Harbor. And, you know, the thing that happens is that we didn't see it coming, but we probably should have been more prepared for something like this. And we were very lucky that the planes that came in on Sunday, most of the sailors weren't on the ships. The casualty rate would have been much higher had it not been a Sunday, because they kind of, on the weekends, they didn't really keep the full crew on the ships. But man, I mean, it was turmoil, and it was hectic, and everybody was running around, and no one knew exactly how to respond to this. But look how much smoke as people are watching this. This is an amateur filmmaker who is recording this. Okay, so there's Pearl Harbor there. So we call it a date that will live in infamy. Of course, that was FDR's words, and now that gives us the ability to get into this war. The thing about FDR is he's been pressured by both England and France to sort of get into this war and help him out. But remember the Neutrality Acts. We didn't want to get involved. And really, FDR actually saw that we probably should have, but he knew the American people were not. So it took this, and then we declared war against Japan, and that brought us into both a 2-front war, which is a lot. Right now we're fighting Japan, and we're going to go help go help England and Russia against Germany. Well, we call ourselves the great arsenal of democracy, and this leads to something that we still hold on to today, that we no longer can have this attitude that we're going to stick out of conflicts. We need to get involved, and we're going to go over there and sort of do what we need to do. We had already been regeared for military purposes, which means that when we're entering the war, we're already starting to build tanks and bombs and guns. And the intention is we're probably going to be using these at some point. In fact, I think I have some statistics here to show you how much the federal government put into building up the military. Look at how much money we spent on aircrafts and ships and ammos and combat and motor vehicles, right? You know, this is where we become this military might. We didn't even know what we were capable of. You know, most historians agree with that as we came into this, the weight of our technology is what really sticks. Well, we have to get the American people behind this whole story. And in order to do that, well, we're going to turn to propaganda. And so we overrun and overwhelm the American people with propaganda from all different angles. And I thought, this is kind of heavy stuff. It'd be kind of fun to show you that even Walt Disney got involved, and he used his characters, and Warner Brothers, got involved and used his characters to produce pro-war propaganda, and they would show these at the beginning of movie theaters.
Dollars pouring into the hands of the American worker. Now, in the mind of the average worker live two separate personalities. One, the thrifty.
Wait a bit, laddie. You're going to save a bit of that, aren't you? Sure.
Oftentimes, idle money burns a hole in your pocket, which brings out the other personality. The spendthrift.
Hi, big shot. Come on with me. I'll show you how to spend your dough.
Oh, boy, oh, boy, oh, boy.
I got a couple of good dates.
But, laddie, I've got some better dates.
Important ones, too. When every American should pay his or her income tax gladly and proudly.
Notice that it's every couple months
year,
they're expecting you to
thanks
pay.
to Hitler and Hirohito, taxes are higher than ever before. Will you have enough money on hand to meet your payments when they fall due?
We'll take care of that later. Forget it.
But you don't want to forget our fighting men, do you?
No, sir.
Then you'll have to start saving right away to meet your tax payments.
Listen, chum. Spend it. It's your dough.
Yeah, it's my dough.
Aye, laddie. It's your dough. But it's your war, too. You must save for victory.
What's money for? Spend it. Shoot the works.
Nay, you must save it. Spend. Save.
Spend, save, spend, save, spend,
Save,
spend,
save,
spend,
save,
spend,
save,
spend, spend,
save,
spend.
Well, now what are you going to do? Spend for the Axis? Or save for taxes? Just remember, every dollar you spend for something you don't need is a dollar spent to help the Axis. That's right. And every dollar you sock away for taxes is another dollar to sock the Axis.
Okay. So, you get the idea, right? So they're throwing these propaganda films at you. And they're expecting you to put a lot of money towards this and help out this war effort. And it does work. Americans, they kind of circle around this and rally around the cause. Okay, well, before we get overseas for a few minutes, let's take a quick look and talk about the different types of workers that we have. So you've got Mexican Americans, and the Lulaks, Indian Americans, African Americans, and women all get a chance to get in the industrial labor force because all these men now are going overseas. Now, this is an opportunity for them to sort of get into work. And, yes, women have taken on a different role here. I mean, there's still the housewife waiting at home, but there's also this, right? There is the woman who's working alongside the man to build the airplane jet wings here, as you're seeing right here, or this is pretty cool, African American women here building. And so, you have to make the argument that these people are as important as the soldiers and the sailors that fought the war. And I know that those are the ones that we romanticize, we love to talk about, but really, it's these guys, it's these women and these minorities that end up building the weapons and the tanks that we use to fight. Of course, this is Rosie the Riveter. And now one thing that we really love of Rosie is that she demonstrates a sort of resilience for all Americans. It's not just women, but this idea that we step up and do what we need to do when we need to do it, right? I love the Saturday Evening Poet post sort of celebrating what the new Rosies become. Now, there are some women who do get involved in war, right? And this is the first time we start to see this. We have the Whacks and the Waves, and their job was some of them were pilots. A lot of them worked at radar. I mean, you didn't really have them on boots on the ground necessarily, but they were out there and they were working, they were fighting. And here's some women, some Whack picking up their clothing. Now, what's amazing about this is it leads to a trend here. And I wanted to show you these two soldiers right here, because these are the first two women to ever make a special forces group. A couple years ago, these two passed one of the most difficult programs, and that's the Ranger program. And, most men can't pass the Ranger program. So pretty awesome that, you see women evolving here in wartime as time goes on. Marriage rates rose because all these guys wanted to marry their gals before they ran off to war. So they'd get married real quick. They'd buy a house. And then all of a sudden, this is the birth of daycare. They need childcare because women are now working. Isn't that fascinating kind of take on that? Many of you might be familiar with or use that today. Well, African Americans, let's take a look at a view of minorities here, and then we'll get moving. African Americans launched something called the Double V campaign. And what they did is they called for victory overseas and equal rights at home. They saw an opportunity to kind of fulfill two goals they have. And so a lot of black people leave the South to take jobs in war industries. So they move north into specific areas in the cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. And they did encounter violent resistance, but, they just sort of, you needed them. I love this portrayal here of the diversity and problems of America, right? You've got now all kinds of different people building things, doing things of color. But of course, in the background, always haunting them, is the Ku Klux Klan member there. Okay, another Native American group minority group that managed to make a lot of headway are the Code Talkers. And I love the story of the Code Talkers. 400 Navajos will be brought up to serve in the war. Now, what happens is that, remember all that Americanization, forget your language, forget your culture. Well, we go back to northern Arizona. We're like, I hope you remembered it because we'd like you to use it. And so we send them out to the jungle. And the reason we did this is because every other code that we tried to use, the Japanese broke. So we thought, okay, we need something that no one can break. Now, Navajo is a very complicated language. There's no one language like it around the world. And so it's very hard to sort of decipher it. I want to show you a clip. They actually made a movie about it. I thought it'd be cool to kind of show you a clip of what happens and how we use Code Talkers. Some people believe Code Talkers are as important as anybody in sort of winning the war in the Pacific Theater.
Stop! You lay the damn coordinates! Arizona! It's okay, go! And then okay. Cop. Back there, shorty. Cop. Kashi. Unachi. Cop. Listen. Say. Kashi. Cop. Say. Fire. Joey Dono. Cop. Hey. Let's go. Let's go. 水の中で喋っているように聞こえます。英語でやりましょうか。Let's not. Picka. Let's not. Picka. Ego she. Target reference, Dog 1, south 700, elevation 050.
So, it gives you a little taste there of the importance of Code Talk. I love that scene where sounds like they're speaking underwater, right? They couldn't really make sense of it. Well, that's a very optimistic and proud story. One that doesn't seem to be so proud is what happens to Japanese Americans. So one thing that many of you might not know, some of you might, is that the idea was you cannot trust the Japanese Americans because of their dedication, loyalty to their home country. So in a moment, I think, of true regret and shame, we are okay with FDR's executive order, which is we're rounding up Japanese Americans, we're moving them from their homes and putting them in relocation centers in the middle of nowhere. 112,000 Japanese Americans will be removed there. Sort of a sad story, isn't it? You know, look at these little kids here. And one of the, you know, we'll look at some of the places where they're taken, but they don't really get this. They don't understand why this is. They're just Americans, and they're told they need to leave their home. Most of them are from California, Northern California, San Francisco area. And you need to leave your home. We're going to send you out in the middle of the desert. This picture specifically haunts me. This little boy here, you know, very, very sorrowful, obviously, trying to deal with this. If you notice some of the major relocation centers, Topaz is not very far away. And if you ever go to Delta, Utah, about 3.5, 4 hours south of here, right about 3, you can go see a pretty cool museum. Topaz is not too far away from Delta, and it was one of the larger centers. And so you can imagine they take them on a train in California, in the middle of the West Desert out there in the House Range. And, you know, they just lived out there in these isolated places. And it's a sorrowful story because, you know, the truth is that were there people who were loyal to Japan? Sure. Was there mass conspiracy that Japanese Americans were trying to take over the country? No, there wasn't. But you know what happens when fear sort of owns us. We do things, I think, when we look back and regret. Well, let's take a look at the actual war itself. So we will mobilize 16.4 million Americans. Some of those are training. Some of them are in Illinois. Some of them are going to be in Philippines. Some of them will be in Europe. So they all play a role, you know. They all play a role in fighting for this war. And I'm going to talk about this at the end of the presentation. But one thing that you're going to do specific with this discussion, one of your assignments is to find out where your great and some of you great-great-grandparents were during World War II. So I'll come back to that, but that's going to be an assignment that I need you to figure out for me. Okay, let's look at the two major forces, or those two major generals. We have Douglas MacArthur here and Eisenhower. Both of them will be very capable. MacArthur's a no bullcrap kind of guy. Eisenhower, well, I mean, Eisenhower's a no bullcrap kind of guy too, but he is a little bit more merciful, forgiving than MacArthur, who expects a soldier to be a soldier all the time. Before we get further into this, let me just explain to you that America is pretty lucky. We've been pretty lucky in wars lately because we've never really had to fight on our home country. And it's given us the ability to kind of keep a lot of our civilians safe and a lot of our architecture. But this war is the worst war in world history in terms of numbers and damage and casualty. And that is because we have perfected modernity at this point. Now that seems weird, perfected may be the wrong word, but definitely from what it was World War I. You know, no longer are we dealing with tanks that are slow, machine guns that jam up, planes that fight each other. We're not dealing with jets and massive tanks and massive machine, the Tommy gun. So, you know, the technology will just destroy it. And of course, the heart of it is the atomic bomb. This actually isn't an atomic bomb. This is Dresden, Germany, which we bomb and absolutely destroy. There are still places in Europe that have not completely repaired themselves and it's been almost 80 years. It's been 80 years. So, you know, this is something to keep in mind when you think about the magnitude. We've never seen anything so big. And I'll give you casualty numbers at the end. Well, what I thought I'd do is I would look at the two different theaters. We'll look at the Pacific theater, and then we'll look at the European theater. The Pacific theater, of course, is that versus Japan. Now, the Pacific theater has stages, and we're going to go through phases. We're going to go through the different phases. of the Pacific Theater. So the first one's called the Japanese Offensive, which happens from about 1941 to 1943. Yeah, we'll really say 42 into that. Then you have what we call the Stalemate, which is from about 1942 into 1943. And then we have the Island Hop. It's often called the leapfrogging. And this happens from 1943 to 1945. And then we have the bombings, which happens, and they sort of overlap with the island hopping. So 1944 into 1945. Okay. Now, we're just going to briefly go over these 4 different ones, but this is, West Point came up with these. This sort of gives us a really good idea of what's happening here. Well, we already talked a little bit about the Japanese offensive, but before we talk too much about what's happening in this war, we have to briefly mention Japanese honor. One of the most important parts of understanding Japan is understanding their dedication to honor. For hundreds of years, they would say thousands of years, they have held on to a belief that the Japanese state, the Japanese people are protected and they are a worthy people. And so you need to keep up with that sort of honor. If you ever break that honor, there's no coming back from it. There's no coming back from shame. And some of you have maybe heard of some of these things that they do, the Bushido Way, which that they will kill themselves if they feel like they cannot keep their honor together. It's better to die than to ever be dishonorable. Now you have to understand that's different from us. We believe in coming back from shame and mistakes. That's not really the Japanese way. When you're told, especially as a soldier, when you're told to do something, you do it. And if you can't, then you don't deserve to be recognized by the empire. Okay, so keep that in mind. The 2 major players for the Japanese during World War II is Emperor Hirohito, who is like a god to the Japanese people. And then you have this very, very aggressive general, Tojo, who is all about fighting and never, ever surrendering the dishonor you cannot have if you're a Japanese person. So propaganda, here we go. We've got a war to start. So let's take a look at the 2 major players for our side. So Douglas MacArthur, we talked about, he is the admiral. He's the general. He'll be in charge for the Marines that land on the islands. And this is Admiral Nimitz, who will be in charge for the Navy, who will be fighting on the seas and dropping off the soldiers on the land. Okay, well, this is the Japanese fleet. It is no joke. The first real part, this is still part of the first phase here, is the Battle of Midway. And Midway was our sort of final chance. I think I've got, maybe I don't. There we go. Let me go to this map. This will help you out. And then I'll come back to Midway. Midway's right here. So what Japan, this is part of Japanese ideas of the offensive, was that once they took out Pearl Harbor, they were going to take out Midway. And then they perhaps were going to circle around here and hit North America. At least that's what we're thinking. So we knew we had to stop Midway. Okay, so this was part of that Japanese offensive.
The Battle of Midway was where everything changed. We broke their codes and their plans were clear. Most of our fleet was waiting for the Japs to show up, ready to get revenge for what they did to us at Pearl Harbor. We had 3 carriers there, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. To back them up, we had 8 cruisers and 17 destroyers. But the Jap fleet was awesome. They sent 6 carriers, 7 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 42 destroyers. Against their fleet, ours looked insignificant. The battle lasted 3 days, and when the smoke cleared, we saw the damage we'd done. We took out 4 of their carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Hiryu, and the Soryu, and the heavy cruiser Mikuma. All up, we only lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and a single destroyer. But it wasn't just ships that the Japs lost at Midway. We also splashed twice as many of their planes as they got of ours. A lot of good Japanese pilots were shot down at Midway, and I don't think their Air Corps ever recovered. In just 3 days, we'd broken the back of their fleet. Their carrier strike force, the Kiru Batai, was all but wiped out. Even with their fleet wrecked, the Japs still had control of most of the Pacific.
Okay.
And thousands...
So, that's the power of Midway. Then I'll come back to this. We broke their codes, and we understood that they were where they were going, and we were able to sort of, actually, we had some pretty luck with the recon planes that sighted exactly where they were, and we were able to ambush them, and we just bombed the crap out of them. So we took out their airplanes, which the video says, which really they were never able to develop. They were never able to come back from it. And so this is the last time they'll really be offensive. For the rest of the time, they'll be defensive. Okay, so that moves to, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, Guadalcanal, which is the stalemate. And so when everything seems to be from about August to February 42 to 43, there's this 6-month really brutal war, and there's disease, malaria, tens of thousands of soldiers die on both sides. But eventually we're able to take out Guadalcanal. And once we take that moves us to the third and most important stage, which is the island hopping. And so the idea with island hopping is that all of these blue splotches, these are islands that we need to go to and take them back from the Japanese. Now, what the Japanese would do is they would take their guys and they would drop them off on these islands, and then they would leave them there. And the only way home was if you win. There was no coming home if you defeat. And so that means when we go to these islands, it was like, okay, you take them out, or they're not going to surrender. You have to take every last one of them. Some of them will end up doing seppuku and they'll kill themselves, but most of them will fight until the last man. There's Guadalcanal there. So the idea is that we're going to take this island right here. MacArthur's going to come up here to Palule Islands. Nimitz is going to come this way, and we will meet at the Philippines. From the Philippines, then we will hit Japan if we need to. So island hop, different places here. Okay, well, let's come back to this real quick and kind of show you. Everything goes pretty well. I mean, I should say pretty well. Some of these islands are absolutely insane. Peleliu, I don't know, see if I can find it on here. I don't know if it's on here. It was nasty. They run out of water there, and they poisoned the water. Oh, there's Peleliu right there. They poisoned the water there. So it ends up being a horrible situation. But when we get close to Japan, when we get over here, we start to needing to attack the actual Japanese islands. So these are no longer just territories. These are islands. So it would be the difference is if somebody attacked us today and attacked Puerto Rico, we'd be mad. But we'd be really mad if someone attacked Hawaii. And so when we start getting to Iwo Jima, that's actually attacking Hawaii. That's actually attacking the Japanese countries. Islands, sorry about that. So let's take a look at this battle. It's often one of the more famous ones. It happened in 1945. We land on this island. There's nothing there. It's just this kind of ashy, volcanic island. Nothing grows there. But it was a very important strategic point, and it was a Japanese island. So what happens is that the Japanese are fortified so perfectly in this place. And what comes out of it is just a brutal, brutal battle. I actually want to show you a clip. They did a movie. It was really good. It was from the Japanese perspective. But the idea was, again, if you don't win, you're not coming home. So I want you to watch the Japanese here as they are fighting against the Americans. Watch the landing here that happens.
砲撃は開始しますか。
待て。
みんな砲撃開始を望んでいます。総員待機。総員待機。総員待機。
So here comes the Americans landing their crafts here.
抵抗しなければあっという間に海岸を取られてしまう。
浜を埋め尽くすまで待て。行きましょう。攻撃開始。
攻撃開始。攻撃開始。
So our Marines will just get hammered here by all these underground tunnels, underground bunkers. Okay, so just the brutality of Iwo Jima. Finally, we managed to take them, but those people that don't die from that, they end up killing themselves, many of them. Well, this famous picture comes from Iwo Jima, right? This is where the Marines lift the flag at Mount Suribachi in celebration of our victory there at Iwo Jima. The final and last battle in the Pacific Theater, and then I think I'll stop here and then I'll come back and record a little bit more about World War II, is the Battle of Okinawa. This battle is nicknamed the Typhoon of Steel, and it was brutal. Because we get introduced to this concept of kamikaze attacks, and what happens is that before this time, thousands of Japanese dedicated themselves to the Japanese Empire, and so they would, in some ways, it's really a suicide bomber. They would attach themselves to boats or to planes, and they would fly into ships. And the idea was you're sacrificing yourself for the empire. Now, this was the last island that needs to be taken before the main island, Japan. So it was very brutal. Now, we'll lose 65,000. This is one of the bloodiest. It's the bloodiest of the Pacific Theater. And 100,000 Japanese were, taken, captured, killed. Many of them committed suicide. So one quick clip about Okinawa here.
Squadrons of dive bombers, our dive bombers, fly toward the island of Okinawa to meet the Japs. We can see the yellow smoke of the gunfire above the battleships. We are passing transports over our starboard and over our port as we plow ahead, headed for the beach. I'm headed for the Jap.
We debarked from our ships. We landed on Okinawa and we had no idea of what kind of resistance we will encounter. There were no Japanese, there were no natives. There was nothing. We made our way immediately to the airport that had been deserted by the Japanese, and we found a good many destroyed planes and bombs, but no resistance. By the end of the second day, we had crossed the island, and that was when our trouble began. Our progress was not by miles and not by hundreds of yards, but practically by inches, because the resistance was very strong. There's not a single one of my team who got away uninjured.
Okay, so you can see here, this is the last one. It was a brutal one, but we're finally able to get this done. Now, at the same time, we start to bomb Tokyo, because even though we've taken all these islands, Japan, remember, they don't surrender. That's a dishonor. And so we are bombing constantly. Tons, I think 2 kilometers of Tokyo just gets completely bombed. I think 100,000 dies into firebombing in Tokyo. So, and it brings up important questions about, how far do we need to go to win this war? And we'll come back to that, actually, when we look at the Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the atomic bombs. So what I want to do is pause right here, and I will come back tomorrow, finish this up. Shouldn't take me too much longer, but that's the first part and really into the second part of World War II. Okay, so you don't need to write anything about this yet. I'll have you do something about this when I finish the segment, but please watch this, take good notes about it. Okay, guys, that's it.